Ed and Joel, thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, Ed, and good morning, Joel, I believe.
Good morning.
This is an intercontinental panel. Maybe we should start. I mean, I've made introductions, but maybe we should start by Joel just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Yes, I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of New South Wales here in sunny Sydney, Australia, and I run a large research lab that does all kinds of different things. But one of the main things we do is study mental imagery, visual imagery, and we've been doing that for about 12, 13 years now. We've developed all kinds of interesting ways to measure imagery objectively, and then once we had that way, we've done all kinds of interesting experiments I'm sure we'll get to in a second.
Ed, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Well, for the last 50 years, it's been in this path of computer graphics and Pixar and Disney. And a couple of years ago, I retired from Pixar with the successor put in place. And now I'm consulting and writing, and I'm surprisingly busier than ever.
Amazing. That's great to hear. Joel, let's start with you. And I know a pertinent question in terms of the research on visual imagery. How do you study something that is so intangible?
Yeah, so that's the big question, right? So I've been fascinated with studying consciousness for many years, and before I did my PhD. And studying imagery is really sort of an element of studying consciousness. And when we started work on it, there was no objective, reliable way to measure it. You had to use questionnaires or interview people and ask them their subjective opinions about their own imagery, give it a number, that kind of thing. Then we developed a more objective way to measure it when we actually use a visual illusion, something called binocular rivalry. And I won't go into the real details here because it's not the time or the place, but we can sort of hack this visual illusion to measure the sensory strength of visual imagery. And that's a more reliable and more objective method. The only problem is it's harder to scale up, it's harder to do online, but we're trying to now overcome that. In addition to that, we have other methods we can now use with advanced fMRI, so brain scanning we can use to measure someone's imagery, where in the brain it's happening, how strong it is, and we're developing other ways of using your pupil response. So it turns out your pupil will contract when you imagine bright things, and we can also use that. So there's a number of different methods now, from subjective to more objective, but I think sort of the combination of multiple methods is really going to be the way to go.
And Ed, in terms of visual imagery, you're a unique case in a sense.
That's right. I can't visualize at all. I've dreamed a few times where I had mental images. I know what it means to do it, but even when I dream, I don't see images. And I never even thought about it until a few years ago. I mean, I didn't know what was going on this side of other people's heads. So I was able to do a lot of things just perfectly fine. And it was only a few years ago that I discovered that actually this was not. I was pegged at one side in terms of the ability to visualize, which is that I can't.
Tell me more about that. How did you actually discover? I mean, let's put some context here. You worked at Pixar, which some people would associate visual imagery with creativity, and obviously you are extremely creative, if not one of the most creative individuals. And how did you come to discovery that you actually had no visual imagery, or the notion that this wasn't the case with everyone else?
Well, the starting point was I'm a meditator, and I have a friend who's actually the CFO of Pixar who took us public, and he retired several years ago to start a meditation group based upon Tibetan meditation. And because he's a good friend, and I'm aware that Tibetan meditation relies on visualization, I said, could you teach me how to meditate this way? And he said, yeah, as a starting point, just visualize the sphere in front of you. Close your eyes and visualize the sphere. So I said, okay, I'll go do that. So I went home, closed my eyes, I said, black. Nothing. I tried for a week. Now I was startled because I thought, wait a minute, I came up with fundamental techniques for generating surfaces used in computer graphics today for motion pictures and animation and all the special effects. And I didn't do it with mathematics, and I didn't do it with visual imagery. And I remember the process that I was going through. And I remember standing in front of a whiteboard because I could write things on the board, and then the problem would go down into my brain, and I had no access to it at all. But I feel conscious. I would just sort of like do this, knowing that I was working on it, and then something would bubble up. I'd interact at the whiteboard, and then run into a problem, and then back down it would go. So that's what I remember. So I was surprised that I couldn't do this. I went back to my friend, and he said, "Oh, some people can't," and that was it. But I went to one of our production designers. That's the lead artistic designer for a film, and I said, Can you actually see the images?" And he said, "Well, of course I can. And in fact, there are some people who can see it so strongly that they open their eyes and they can trace what they see." Now, what I thought at the time was, oh, that's probably why they are these great artists, and I'm not. I'm actually a reasonably good artist at drawing, but that would be the difference, I thought. But then I started to tell the story when I had these random lunches, which I'd have on every week with people at both studios, Pixar and Disney. And I'd ask them if they could visualize. And what I found was that they were all over the map, and I didn't see a correlation between what they did and the ability to visualize. So it was kind of curious. It was this background thing. And then I had dinner in San Francisco with Glenn Keane. He actually just directed a film which is up for an Oscar this year. He is one of the best hand-drawn animators of all time. He's extraordinary and a super nice guy. So I told him the story, sort of expecting what he would say, and he said, "Oh, I can't visualize either. I've never been able to see anything when I close my eyes. And I have to interact with paper to get it out." Now at this point now, I said, okay, this is intriguing because the best animator I know of all time can't do it. And then I learned about this work that was being done with Aphantasia back at Exeter. And so I started an interaction with the professor back there. And I was getting near retirement, and I realized, I've got some of the best artists and technical people and mathematicians here. So I'd like to give the study or the test for ability to visualize to this group because I have this cool thing, and that is I know what their jobs are. And so I asked each one who filled it out to put down what they saw as their top 2 or 3 professional activities. And then with that, I could do the correlation, which is what I presented at this conference at Exeter in England. But at the same time, it generated all this conversation. And I would then talk with the artists who were at the extreme end of being able to visualize. So one of them, for instance, if he saw a movie, would never see it again because he could already see the whole movie in his head. He could play the whole thing. He also had synesthesia too. But one of the cool things was that with one of the films, the 2 directors who had worked together for 13 years as storyboard artists, and they'd never discussed this, one of them was hyperphantasia, that is, she could visualize anything, and the other one couldn't visualize at all. And they had never discussed it, and they didn't know it until I raised the question. Now, interestingly enough, some of the people who have aphantasia are aware that other people can visualize, but they, in his case, actually, this is true in Glenn Keane's case, because I met with him after our London event, and they felt better because they somehow felt like they were deficient.
Okay.
But obviously they're not. They're just, their brain works in a different way.
Exactly.
That's
an amazing
exactly
story. That was good.
No, Joe, go ahead. I like to hear your point of view as what does psychology have to say about all of this? How do you unpack it?
Yeah, so Ed's point there that it's not, I get a lot of emails saying, oh, this is the reason my career didn't advance, or I didn't make this, or my relationship fell apart. And all the data we've got so far is suggesting that's not the case at all. It's really sort of more in the range of a neural diversity or diversity of mind. And all the testing we've done looking at memory suggests that if you don't have imagery, you figure out a different strategy to achieve the same outcome. And so if you just test someone on some memory task, you may not even notice they don't have imagery, because they've developed really good strategies for doing that using different parts of the brain. So it's not a disability. There's nothing sort of negative about it. It's just a sort of natural difference in the spectrum that we're seeing. That being said, we just published a paper that came out last week showing that when people with aphantasia read these sort of scary stories, their emotional response that we measured with skin conductance is sort of muted, if you like, compared to people that have imagery. So there seems to be an interesting role for imagery there, connecting our thoughts to our emotional reaction. And that's the one area we've seen the biggest difference between someone with imagery and someone without imagery. But in most of the other areas, we see some differences, but nothing major.
So, Joel, when you say same outcomes, I would expect different strategies would lead to, equally valid and equally strong, but different outcomes in a sense.
It depends how you're measuring. So we've been doing a lot of studies into what's called like working memory and visual working memory in particular. And that's the kind of experiments where you put some visual things on the screen and you have to remember the shapes, the colors, the orientations for maybe 6-7 seconds, and then we test you on that. And if I do that experiment, I visualize and hold those shapes and colors and angles in my mind's eye, sort of hold it there until the test comes up, and then I answer questions about it. And someone without imagery will use a very different strategy. They'll use propositions, semantics, sometimes geometry. So that's one thing. Also, an interesting aspect that people with aphantasia in general have very good spatial capabilities and spatial orientation, spatial understanding of space around them, behind them, which seems to be relying on different brain networks and brain pathways to the actual imagery visualizing of an object. And so with these different strategies, they can still remember the same number of objects. They still perform the same in these memory tasks. It's just they're using different brain areas. And what's interesting then, if you try and perturb and disrupt those memories with flashing bright lights and things like that, if you're using imagery, your memory performance is disrupted. If you're using a different strategy that aphantasics do, then bright backgrounds, flashing lights don't really disrupt your memory performance.
Just on that different strategies, I heard first that dancers and athletes have different sort of strategies in terms of it's a more embodied sort of strategy. Is that the case?
Yeah. So the Glenn Keane, the animator that Ed was just talking about, Ed has these amazing videos of him. He embodies and sort of acts out some of the animations, doesn't he, Ed? And you see a lot of athletes doing that, especially in the Winter Olympics. You'll see people closing their eyes and using motor imagery and tactile imagery, probably sometimes visual imagery as well, but sometimes not. So this is a whole other dimension of aphantasia we're going into now, which is multi-sensory aphantasia, or do you just have pure visual aphantasia?
Ed,
I have very strong spatial sense, which is how I did all this surface work. And when my undergraduate degree was in physics, and I could solve a lot of problems easily. It was all spatial. It was neither math nor pictures. The strategies for learning things like the memory palace and so forth doesn't work with me. And I tried for years, and I didn't know why. People say this works. No, it doesn't work. No, actually, it doesn't work for me. It may work for others. I hadn't heard about the video disruption that Joel just mentioned, but I do know that I find that lights and other things like that don't disrupt me, but small audio things will disrupt my ability to do stuff and my memory. But at this point, it's like, okay, it's different. It's okay.
But at Pixar, I know that also everyone there had lots of different classes on everything from pottery to computer programming, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you must have seen a whole variety. I mean, and that's part of the reason why you did that survey at the end. You must have seen a whole variety of creativity. I mean, outputs. Let's put it that way. Were you aware that people were also, creating internally, visually, or more embodied in a more embodied way, in a more geometric way? Were you also aware that people were creating differently?
Well, not until after this, because I hadn't thought about it. It's like, you're good at something, you're good at something. And I promised everybody that I would return after retiring to give them the results of the study at both studios. And so we had 600 people that participated. The individual groups weren't terribly large, except for a couple of the groups. So there's some statistical questions about the results. But the result was that left-handed people were slightly better than right, but not a lot, and females were a little better than males, not a lot. The artists slightly better. The one group stood out as statistically significant. It was a big group as the best people at visualization, the production management. Now, I can't draw long-term conclusions from that because our very skilled and capable production managers frequently came out of film schools. So they're not representative of managers or organizers in general, but it was like the big surprise. And of course, what they did was cheered because it was as if they had won something. But then they all just went back to work and did whatever they did. It was interesting. And for the people who had aphantasia, it was more, and they did express this, like, okay, they were relieved to know that there wasn't anything wrong.
Joel, you mentioned the link between this and emotions. What do you think? Are there implications in terms of health and in terms of our mental health, more particularly?
Yeah, I think there are. So this is sort of the tip of the iceberg with this first study. We've got a number of studies that are ongoing at the moment. We haven't published yet. So we know that imagery seems to play this crucial role linking our thoughts, that positive or negative, with our emotions, right? And it's almost like what you think about almost gets pictured in your visual cortex and tricks the rest of your brain, if you like, into almost thinking it's real, or it's more real than if it's just a pure thought. And so you respond to it more emotionally. And so we're now looking at the role of imagery in PTSD. So we have analogs of PTSD we run in the lab, and we haven't published a paper yet, but as a preview, it looks like if you are aphantasic, the probability of having so-called flashbacks, PTSD style, is much less. We're looking at the role of imagery and aphantasia in mind wandering, also in sort of thought control, if you like, the ability, a bit like Ed was mentioning in meditation, the ability to sort of dampen down our thoughts, not think about something. And it seems also that if you don't have imagery, that's easier as well. For example, if I say, don't think about the pink elephant, right? If you have imagery, the pink elephant pops into your head. If you don't, it seems to be much easier to not think about that. And that is interesting implications to addiction, to eating disorders, all kinds of things. So there does seem to be this link between imagery and not having imagery that plugs into multiple disorders.
And as Ed found out, do you see any link between the capacity or for visual imagery and what people do, being producers or managers or designers? But is there such a thing?
Yeah, there's some data suggesting a link between sort of job and your degree of imagery. Again, there are general trends, but I always want to be careful in saying that doesn't mean that if you are aphantasic, you can be an artist, you can be an entrepreneur, you can be anything. So generally speaking, there are trends that you see people in the STEM industries as are more likely to be aphantasic than other industries. But again, these are just generalities looking at the means. So we're now also wanting to look at creativity and imagery. So there's a sort of imagery and creativity are two things historically that are very difficult to measure scientifically. And so we
Mm-hmm.
have a nice way to measure imagery now. We're trying to work on a better way to measure creativity.
Yeah.
My hypothesis is that while coming up with new, interesting, random and novel ideas probably doesn't rely too much on the imagery part. I think the second stage of that, if you think of that as divergent thinking, come up with crazy divergent ideas, then converging those ideas back to practical, useful things. I think to some degree that convergence may rely on imagery more. Will that idea work? Is it practical? Trying to simulate those scenarios. If you have imagery, you'll probably use imagery for that. If you don't, you'll use other means, sort of spatial manipulations Ed mentioned, or mathematics, or other ways. But again, the trend we're seeing is just using a different strategy to try and achieve similar outcomes.
So in terms of watching the directors and storytellers at Pixar, and this is just an observation from this group of people, but the one thing I've noticed, the good ones, is they have a greater ability to let stuff go. So they work on something, it doesn't work, then let it go. And I worked closely for years with Steve Jobs, who's got a very strong personality, but he had this remarkable ability. As soon as something could be shown him not to work, he'd let it go immediately. And there was something about this notion of just releasing something, which is some people can't do, that they grab onto it. And I think it is related to creativity, but it's not the potential for creativity. It's like a personality thing that gets in their way of creativity. So it's like a secondary cause potentially, but I don't know. It's just an observation from the people that I know.
Yeah.
Flexible thinking
Go on.
would be flexible thinking, I think, is what that kind of, there are ways that you could test that in the lab, right, where you're doing a task and the reward comes from one thing, and then you change the rules of the task completely. And some people go, oh, the rules changed. Oh, great. I'll just learn the new rule. No problem. Other people get stuck on this rule and it takes them a long time to budge and change their strategy. So it's this idea of flexible thinking. When things change around me, how agile can I be, and how easily can I drop that old rule and the old settings and look for a new set of rules?
Okay. As a final question for both of you, you're both world experts on creativity. So what message or advice would you give to our audience today? Ed, you first.
Yeah. So there are two anecdotes. One of them is that when people come into the studio, like animators, and they go into the screenings where people are looking at their work and they feel initially like they're being judged, and so they are very cautious and they're not very flexible. What they learn is that they see everybody going through it and that it's safe, so they learn to let stuff go, which is I think is a good thing and a promising thing. But again, this is anecdotal. And the other thing was just a thought, was one of these revelations, and I don't even know what it means, but it was from the conference at Exeter, where they had these breakout groups, and they were just asking people about the pros and cons. And I kind of assumed like being able to visualize would be a really strong plus, but there were people in there who said they wish they couldn't visualize, to Joel's point, because there are things that they can't let go of from the past that they wish they could. And then one of the lectures later in front of the whole group, and this doesn't mean anything because I don't know what the proportions were of attendees of in terms of aphantasic or hyperphantasic or the researchers, but the question was, if you could take a pill that would swap your abilities between hyper and aphantasia, but the pill was irreversible, would you take the pill? The shock to me was about half the people raised their hand yes, including me. I just, for me, it's like, oh, that's really interesting that they would do that. And it's not that I wanted to lose anything that I had, but I'd like to be able to visualize my mother, for instance. But there are people there who don't want to be at that extreme.
Yeah.
Joel,
that's a really interesting point there. Before I jump on the creativity bit, so we're looking at ways of combining a training regime with types of brain stimulation. We've shown before that brain stimulation can increase imagery strength. So we think that if you combine that with a training regime, we might be able to give someone with aphantasia imagery. But again, if they get it and they can't switch it off and they hate it,
Mm-hmm,
then we're kind of in ethical muddy water there. And, we have to be very careful with the ethics around that, right? So they might try and sue us, or they may be very unhappy. We destroy their lives. I don't know. So it's a tricky area to go into, because I think if we achieve that, it's not going to be reversible again. So something to think about. In terms of, quick wrapping up, my advice for creativity is that if you think you're not creativity, don't think that. Drop that thought, let it go. I think everyone can be creative to a degree. That doesn't mean doing paintings, playing music, but it means coming up with novel and fantastic and weird ideas, being curious about what you do in your everyday life, in your job, or things in the house at home. So being curious about that and just coming up with new ideas about how to do things from left field, and then just trying them out, being playful with that. So I think everyone can be somewhat creative. It doesn't matter who you are, what your job is. Try it out, play with it, build that as a habit of testing the water with creativity.
All right. Amazing advice to our audience. Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you so much, Ed. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you.